The familiar squeak of the mop against the black and white marble floor echoed through the grand Arcadia hotel lobby. For David Mercer, the sound was the steady rhythm of a life chosen for its silence, its invisibility. Each stroke was a deliberate push against memories of a different life, filled with the screams of sirens and the frantic pulse of a world he'd left behind. Here, there was only the scent of polish, the soft glow of chandeliers, and the quiet dignity of being unseen. David paused, leaning on his mop as he watched a maintenance worker struggle with the lobby's center elevator. The doors kept closing, despite the workers' attempts to keep them open with a rubber doorstop. Something wasn't right. The safety mechanism should have prevented this. "Hey, need a hand?" David called, already moving toward the elevator, his 52-year-old frame still carrying the disciplined posture of his military days. The maintenance worker, young and flustered, shook his head. "I got it. Just a glitch in the—" A sharp metallic snap interrupted him, followed by a woman's scream from inside the elevator. The doors began closing with sudden force, crushing the doorstop. David dropped his mop and sprinted across the lobby. 20 years as a combat medic and trauma surgeon hadn't dulled his reflexes. He heard the frantic voices inside, a woman and her young son trapped as the elevator began to shudder. "Back away from the doors," David shouted, wedging his heavy-duty cleaning tool between the closing panels. The doors resisted, then reluctantly slid back open. The elevator cab hung unevenly, one side lower than the other, a severed cable swinging dangerously above. Inside, a woman clutched her son, both wide-eyed with terror. "Don't move," David said calmly, his voice carrying the same steady authority that had once guided medical teams through battlefield surgeries. "The safety brakes have engaged, but they're not holding evenly." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small multi-tool he always carried, a habit from his former life. With practiced on hands, he pried open the control panel beside the doors, instantly recognizing the outdated Otis system from the early 2000s. "What are you doing?" the maintenance worker asked nervously. "Bypassing the automatic system," David replied, not looking up. His fingers worked with surgical precision, connecting two specific wires. "This model has a secondary mechanical override. When I say now, both of you step forward carefully. Together, same pace. Ready?" The woman nodded, clutching her son's shoulders. "Now." As they stepped forward, David manipulated the wires, sending a manual signal to hold the safety brakes in place. The mother and son crossed the threshold just as the elevator gave another sickening lurch. The hotel manager rushed over, his face pale. "What happened? Is everyone all right?" "Your east cable frayed and snapped," David said, already closing his multi-tool and slipping it back into his pocket. "You've got severe wear on the secondary cable, too. This wasn't a glitch. This was neglect." The manager stared, surprised at the authoritative tone from a man in a janitor's uniform. "The maintenance logs will show the last inspection was 18 months ago," David continued. "That's 6 months overdue. The guide shoes are worn down to metal, and the counterweight needs rebalancing. You're looking at a major liability." "How would you know that?" the manager asked. David shrugged, already backing away. "I worked maintenance for a while in Pittsburgh. Steel mills have elevators, too." The half-truth came easily. He had indeed spent 2 years in Pittsburgh, but in the trauma center, not the mills. "Should get a certified inspector in here before somebody gets hurt." He returned to his mop, resuming his slow, methodical cleaning pattern as if nothing had happened. Just another invisible man doing invisible work. It was all for Emma, his 7-year-old daughter, a safe, predictable world where fathers came home smelling of nothing more dangerous than cleaning supplies, where nightmares stayed firmly in the past, not bleeding into the present. Later that evening, in their small but meticulously kept apartment in Bedford Falls, a once thriving manufacturing town in Pennsylvania, now struggling with the decline of American industry, David sat at the kitchen table with Emma, examining an old Bulova pocket watch with careful precision. "See this mainspring?" David pointed with a tiny screwdriver from the set he'd organized in perfect alignment on a worn leather tool roll. "It's the heart of the watch. When it's wound too tight, it can snap. When it's too loose, the watch runs slow." Emma's eyes were wide with fascination. "Like people, right, Dad? You always say people break when they're wound too tight." David smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. At 52, his face carried the lines of a man who had seen too much, but his eyes still softened when they looked at his daughter. That's right, kiddo. Everything needs the right amount of tension. He carefully placed the repaired spring back into place. Now hand me that escape wheel, the one with the tiny teeth, Vaughty. Emma selected the correct piece from the organized row on the table. Her small fingers were already developing the steadiness needed for detail work, just like her father. How was school today? He asked, fitting the gear into place with hands that had once sutured arteries under mortar fire. We learned about heroes, she said, swinging her legs under the chair. I told them my dad is a hero. David's hands paused momentarily. What did you tell them? That you fix things no one else can see are broken. The simple truth in the child's words. David's throat tightened as he closed the watch case. Not all heroes wear capes, right, Dad? Right, he said softly. Some just carry toolboxes or mops. He tightened the final screw, then wound the watch carefully. The soft, steady ticking filled the kitchen, a sound from another era, when things were built to last and be repaired, not discarded. The world wasn't built by men in suits, Emma, David said. An old saying his father had taught him in the garage where he'd learned to rebuild Chevy's small blocks at 12. It was built by people who know how to use wrenches. The next morning, David moved silently through the Grand Arcadia's lobby, refilling soap dispensers in the public restrooms before the morning rush. The hotel was hosting the annual Blackwood Global Shipping Conference, and security had been increased. Men in dark suits with earpieces stood at strategic points throughout the lobby. As David pushed his cart past a secluded corner near the grand fireplace, he heard voices speaking in rapid Dutch, a language few Americans recognize, but one David knew fluently from his mother's side of the family. De aandeelhouders zullen het milieu-initiatief niet accepteren, a woman said, her tone authoritative, despite the hushed volume. Het zal de winst in het eerste jaar met 18% verminderen. The shareholders will not accept the environmental initiative. It will cut profits by 18% in the first year. Dat is precies waarom we nu moeten handelen, came the reply, also in Dutch. De regelgevende veranderingen zullen over 2 jaar ieders hand forceren. We zullen voorop lopen. That's precisely why we need to move now. The regulatory changes will force everyone's hand in the 2 years. We'll be ahead of the curve. David kept his head down, but his ears remained alert. Years of training had taught him to absorb information while appearing oblivious. De vergadering moet absoluut beveiligd blijven, the woman continued. The meeting must remain absolutely secure. David glanced up briefly. The woman speaking was tall, with steel-gray hair pulled into an elegant chignon. She carried herself with the unmistakable posture of someone accustomed to command. Victoria Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Global Shipping. He recognized her from the business magazines that sometimes got left behind in the hotel suites. She was speaking to a younger man in a severe dark suit, not a bodyguard based on his body language, an executive assistant, perhaps. David continued his work, invisible in his uniform, as he had been countless times before. The skill that had once saved his life in combat zones now served to keep him safely anonymous in civilian life. The revolving doors hissed, slicing through the lobby's hushed atmosphere. A blast of cool autumn air swept in, carrying with it a new energy, sharp, commanding, and cold. A man strode in, flanked by 2 security personnel. He was younger than Victoria by several years, with the same sharp features but none of the subtle warmth in his eyes. Nathan Blackwood, Victoria's younger brother and CFO of the company. He spoke to Victoria in English, loud enough for others to hear. The board members are arriving early. Thompson wants to discuss the Rotterdam terminal before the official meeting. Victoria's expression didn't change, but David noticed the slight stiffening of her shoulders. We'll discuss it upstairs, she replied, smoothly switching to English. As the group moved toward the executive elevators, Victoria's gaze swept the lobby with an air of practiced assessment. For a moment, her eyes landed on David, and he felt a flicker of something. Not the usual dismissal he received from hotel guests, but a brief, evaluating look before she turned away. The doors closed behind the Blackwood entourage, leaving David alone with his cart and his thoughts. Something in the dynamic between the siblings had triggered his old instincts, The ones that had kept him alive in places where danger didn't announce itself with gunfire but with the subtle shift of a conversation. Later that day, David was cleaning the brass fixtures in the corridor outside the Blackwood conference room when the doors burst open. Nathan Blackwood stalked out, his face flushed with anger. Behind him, Victoria stood in the doorway, her expression controlled but her eyes blazing. "This isn't over, Victoria," Nathan snapped, not caring who heard. "The board won't stand for this environmental crusade of yours much longer. We're a shipping company, not a charity." "The world is changing, Nathan," Victoria replied, her voice steady. "Either we change with it, or we become obsolete." Father understood that. "Father isn't here anymore," Nathan said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "And neither is your protective majority share." He turned and strode away, leaving Victoria standing in the doorway. For a brief moment, her composed facade cracked, revealing a flicker of genuine concern before she straightened her shoulders and returned to the meeting. David continued polishing the brass, his movements slow and methodical, giving no indication he had heard anything. But his mind was processing the exchange with the same focused attention he had once applied to battlefield triage assessments. That evening, David finished his final round through the maintenance room, a cavernous space in the hotel's sub-basement filled with pipes, electrical panels, and the massive boilers that heated the century-old building. He checked the pressure gauges on the main steam line, making a mental note that the secondary relief valve was showing signs of wear, something the actual maintenance crew had overlooked. His hands moved with practiced familiarity over the machinery. Most people saw only the gleaming facade of the Grand Arcadia, the marble and brass and crystal chandeliers. But David understood the building's true heart was down here, in the rumbling, hissing guts of industrial-era engineering that kept the heat flowing and the water running. "You know more about this place than the engineers we hired," came a voice from behind him. David turned to find Jack Sullivan leaning against the doorframe. At 58, the head of security carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a former cop. His weathered face had seen enough of humanity's worst to be permanently skeptical, but not enough to kill the underlying decency in his eyes. "Just making sure the pressure relief is working," David said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Old systems like this, you have to stay ahead of the problems." Sullivan nodded, understanding perfectly. Before becoming a cop, he'd worked the Pittsburgh steel mills, where equipment failures weren't just inconvenient, they were lethal. "You were military before this, weren't you?" Sullivan asked, his eyes assessing. David tensed slightly. "What makes you say that?" "The way you move, the way you notice things, the way you call me sir without thinking about it." Sullivan smiled slightly. "And the way you never talk about it." David remained silent, neither confirming nor denying. "Relax," Sullivan said. "I'm not asking for your life story, just making conversation. Most men who know their way around machinery like you do aren't pushing mops for minimum wage." "The pay's not great," David admitted, "but the hours work with my daughter's school schedule." Sullivan nodded. "Single dad?" "Yeah. My brother raised 2 kids alone after his wife passed. Toughest job there is." Sullivan pushed off from the doorframe. "Anyway, I came down to tell you there's a spill on the mezzanine level. Some board member knocked over a coffee service." "I'll take care of it," David said, reaching for his cart. "You know," Sullivan said as David passed him, "not all the guys who come back make it as clean as you have. Whatever you're running from, you're doing a good job of it." David paused. "I'm not running from anything, just trying to raise my kid in peace." Sullivan's eyes held his for a long moment. "Fair enough, but if you ever need anything, my door is always open." David nodded his thanks and headed toward the elevator. The conversation had left him uneasy. He'd spent 7 years cultivating invisibility, and now twice in one day he'd been noticed. First by Victoria Blackwood, now by Sullivan. The carefully constructed anonymity of his life was developing cracks. As he cleaned the coffee spill on the mezzanine, David could hear raised voices from the Blackwood meeting room down the hall. The board meeting had devolved into an argument, with Nathan's voice cutting through the others like a blade. "The Rotterdam terminal numbers are a disaster," he was saying. "Victoria's environmental retrofits have cost us $18 million already, and we're nowhere near compliance." "That's not accurate, Nathan," Victoria's voice replied, calm but firm. "The interim costs are in line with projections, In the long-term savings, projections, savings, Nathan's voice dripped with contempt. Meanwhile, our competitors are undercutting us by 12% because they're not wasting capital on experimental technology. David worked slowly, absorbing the conversation while appearing focused only on his task. Years of practice had made this second nature. In Afghanistan, he'd learned more about incoming threats from casual conversations among locals than from official intelligence briefings. The board has indulged your green vision long enough, Victoria, Nathan continued. But these quarterly numbers speak for themselves. We're hemorrhaging money. That's not what our actual financials show, Victoria replied, her voice hardening. Which raises the question of where you're getting these numbers, Nathan. A tense silence followed. Are you accusing me of something? Nathan's voice had dropped dangerously low. I'm stating a fact, Victoria said evenly. The numbers you're presenting don't match our audited statements. Either you have access to information I don't, or you're deliberately misrepresenting our financial position to this board. David heard the scrape of a chair being pushed back violently. This meeting is adjourned, Nathan announced. I suggest everyone take time to review the full financial package I've distributed. We'll reconvene tomorrow when tempers have cooled. David quickly finished the last of the spill and pushed his cart around the corner just as the boardroom doors opened and executives began filing out. Their faces were tense, uncomfortable. Nobody looked at the janitor as they passed. Nathan was the last to emerge, his face a mask of controlled fury. He was speaking quietly but intensely into his phone. She knows something, he was saying. Push up the timeline. Yes, tonight, after the reception. David kept his head down, but his heart was pounding. The words carried the unmistakable weight of threat. Later that evening, Victoria Blackwood crossed the lobby, speaking on her phone. She had changed from her formal business attire into a more casual but still elegant outfit for the evening reception. David noticed she looked tired, the weight of the day evident in the set of her shoulders. I know someone's manipulating the numbers, she said into her phone, her voice low but clear in the quiet lobby. The Rotterdam terminal reports don't match our internal audits. She paused by one of the large marble pillars, listening to the person on the other end of the call. No, keep this between us for now. I need concrete proof before I bring this to the board. Someone inside the company is deliberately sabotaging the environmental initiative. She listened again, then sighed. I know it's Nathan. I just can't prove it yet. He's been meeting with Arctic Petroleum executives. I have the hotel receipts from Oslo. They stand to lose billions if our clean shipping initiative succeeds and others follow. David kept his distance, methodically cleaning the glass doors at the entrance. He shouldn't be listening, shouldn't be interested. His job was to remain invisible, to keep his head down, to protect the quiet life he had built for Emma. But old habits died hard, and something about Victoria Blackwood's controlled determination reminded him of the officers he had respected most during his military service, the ones who led from the front, who prioritized their people over politics. The next morning, the hotel lobby was bustling with Blackwood Global shipping executives and board members arriving for the final day of the conference. David worked efficiently, keeping the marble floors spotless despite the increased foot traffic. Victoria Blackwood entered through the revolving doors, flanked by her executive assistant and a security detail. She was speaking, her voice low and melodic, but the words were in Dutch again. De penthouse moet opnieuw worden gecontroleerd voor de bestuursvergadering, she said. Ik vertrouw de beveiligingsprotocollen van het hotel niet. The penthouse must be swept again before the board meeting. I don't trust the hotel's security protocols. Her assistant, a flustered young man in his 30s, began stammering in English to the hotel manager about additional security requirements, but Victoria cut him off with a sharp gesture. Just make it happen, Michael, she said in English. Her gaze swept the lobby with an air of profound awareness, missing nothing. When her eyes landed on David, a flicker of recognition crossed her features before she dismissed him as part of the furniture. The look was one he was used to. It was the armor of his new life. Victoria was halfway across the lobby when it happened. A collective gasp rippled through the space. David turned. Victoria Blackwood was stumbling. Her hand, previously gesturing with sharp authority, was now pressed against her chest. Her face, moments ago a mask of cold control, was contorted in pain and confusion. She swayed, her perfect posture collapsing, and crumpled to the floor. Panic erupted. The manager shouted for someone to call 911. Her security team formed a useless, panicked circle around her. She was on her back now, her breath coming in ragged, shallow spurts. She was still speaking, her voice a desperate whisper in Dutch. Mein Hart, she gasped. Het is mijn hart. Vertrouw niemand van hen. Ze proberen me te vermoorden. My heart. It's my heart. Don't trust any of them. They're trying to kill me. No one understood. David dropped his mop. It clattered against the floor. He was moving before he made a conscious decision. The years of training he had tried to bury surged to the surface. He pushed past a stunned bellhop. Sir, you can't, one of the bodyguards said, putting an arm out to block him. David ignored him. He spoke directly to Victoria, his Dutch as crisp and clear as hers had been. Mevrouw Blackwood, kunt u mij horen? My naam is David. Ik kan u helpen. Ms. Blackwood, can you hear me? My name is David. I can help you. Her eyes glazed with pain, focused on him in disbelief. The janitor. Vertel me what you voelt, he commanded, his voice calm, authoritative. Tell me what you feel. His fingers went to the pulse point on her neck. It was thready, dangerously erratic. His mind was already running through the diagnostic algorithm he'd used countless times in the field. Ian Scherpepijn straalt out, naar mijn arm, she gasped. Tintelingen in mijn kak. A sharp pain radiates to my arm, tingling in my jaw, classic heart attack signs. But something was wrong. Her lips were turning blue, a sign of cyanosis that was happening far too quickly for a standard cardiac event. He checked her fingernails. Blue there too, but the left hand showed it more prominently than the right. Asymmetrical presentation. Sir, get back, the bodyguard insisted. Her airway is constricting, David shouted in English, his voice echoing with a command that made people jump. Someone get the emergency kit. But her breathing was stopping, her eyes rolled back, and then he saw it, the detail that changed everything. A slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her left hand just before she went limp, followed by a subtle arching of her back. Not the whole-body convulsion of a seizure, but the specific pattern of certain electrical cardiac anomalies. It's not a standard heart attack, he knew with sickening certainty. It's Brugada syndrome. No time, he muttered, tilting her head back. He put his ear to her chest. Nothing, no heartbeat, cardiac arrest. He placed the heel of his hand on her sternum and began compressions. Hard, fast. The rhythm was seared into his muscle memory from thousands of resuscitations. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, breathe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, breathe. The revolving doors hissed again. A man impeccably dressed with the same sharp features and cold eyes as Victoria strode in. What in God's name is going on here? He roared. Mr. Blackwood, the assistant sobbed. It's your sister. Nathan Blackwood took in the scene, his face contorting in a mask of fury that didn't quite reach his eyes. Get your filthy hands off her. He lunged, grabbing David's shoulder and hauling him back. Stop! You'll kill her! David yelled, trying to shake him off. She's in cardiac arrest. Security! Get this lunatic away from her! Nathan screamed. 2 hotel guards grabbed David's arms, dragging him away from Victoria's still body. You don't understand, he yelled, fighting against them. She needs a defibrillator. Every second you wait, her brain is dying. Nathan knelt beside his sister, his expression a strange, unreadable mix of panic and something colder, more calculating. Just then the wail of sirens grew louder. Paramedics burst through the doors, their gear rattling. They took over, pushing everyone back as they got to work. What happened? One asked, already applying the leads for the portable EKG. Possible heart attack, a security guard answered. The janitor was doing CPR. The paramedic glanced at David, then back at Victoria. How long since loss of consciousness? Less than 2 minutes, David said, his professional voice cutting through his janitor persona. Pulse was irregular before arrest. Cyanosis onset was rapid, and there was a unilateral tremor in the left hand immediately preceding collapse. Check lead V1 and V4ST segment at elevation. The paramedic gave him a sharp look, clearly surprised by the clinical assessment from a man in a janitor's uniform. Got it, he said, then turned to his partner. Let's get the paddles on her chest, charging to 200. Clear. Her body arched. Nothing. Charging to 300. Clear. She jumped again. A faint, erratic rhythm appeared on the monitor. We've got a pulse, the paramedic announced. They loaded her onto a gurney and rushed her out. The lobby was left in a state of shocked silence. David stood between the two guards, his chest heaving, his adrenaline starting to crash. He had saved her. But as he looked at Nathan Blackwood, who was staring at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred, he knew this was far from over. I want him arrested, Nathan said, his voice dangerously low, pointing a finger at David. Now. Arrest him for what? A steady voice cut through the tension. Jack Sullivan, the hotel's head of security, stepped forward, his solid frame subtly positioning itself between Nathan and David. Sullivan was 58, with the weathered face of a man who had spent decades seeing the worst of humanity. His demeanor was calm, but his eyes were sharp with a professional assessment that David recognized from his own military days. Assaulting a guest or saving her life? Because I've got 5 camera angles that will show Mr. Mercer here acting only to provide medical aid. Nathan Blackwood's head snapped toward him. And who are you? The man who reviews the security footage, Sullivan said, his tone even. I assure you, Mr. Blackwood, the only thing those cameras will show is your sister collapsing and my employee preventing a tragedy. 2 police officers had arrived, their expressions weary. What's the situation here? The older one asked, his gaze moving from Nathan's $1,000 suit to David's simple janitor uniform. Nathan immediately took control. That man, he said, his voice dripping with authority, put his hands on my sister. He was behaving erratically. That's a lie, David said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline crash that was starting to hit him. I was responding to a medical emergency. Ms. Blackwood was speaking Dutch. I was the only one who understood what she was saying. The officer looked at David, a skeptical frown on his face. You speak Dutch? Yes, and I recognize the signs of an atypical cardiac event. The paramedics will confirm her heart had stopped. The officer was clearly out of his depth, caught between a billionaire's accusation and a janitor speaking with the vocabulary of a doctor. Sullivan stepped in again. With all due respect, Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice dropping to a low, firm rumble, your identity doesn't change what happened. I'm sure the last thing your sister's company needs right now is a media storm about how her family tried to have the man who saved her life arrested. The word media was the magic bullet. Nathan's jaw tightened. He shot David a look of pure venom, a look that promised this wasn't over. Fine, he spat, but if it turns out he harmed her in any way, I will hold this entire hotel responsible, and I will find him. He turned and stormed out of the lobby, following the path the gurney had taken. The police, seeing the conflict fizzle, took a few witness statements and left, but not before the older officer gave David a hard look. Stay away from them, he warned. You got lucky tonight. Don't push it. David just nodded, his body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. Mr. Davies, the manager, rushed over, his face pale. Mercer, my office, now. In the manager's office, Davies paced back and forth, running his hands through his thinning hair. Do you have any idea what you've done? He demanded. The Blackwoods could ruin us. They're our biggest corporate client. I saved a woman's life, David said, his voice flat. You're a janitor, Davies snapped, his fear making him cruel. You're not supposed to do whatever that was. You're paid to be invisible. David looked at the man's panic and felt a profound weariness settle into his bones. This was why he'd chosen this life. It was simple. Complications got people hurt. He'd had enough of that to last a lifetime. I'm suspended, aren't I? David asked. With pay? Davies said quickly, a pathetic attempt to soften the blow. Just go home, Mercer. Lie low. Don't talk to anyone. We'll handle this. David didn't argue. He turned and walked out, grabbing his worn leather jacket from a locker in the staff room. As he left through the service exit, Jack Sullivan was there. Leaning against the brick wall, a cup of coffee steaming in the cool evening air. You did the right thing, you know, Sullivan said, taking a sip. Doesn't feel like it, David replied, shoving his hands in his pockets. That brother of hers. Something's not right there, Sullivan said. his voice quiet. The way he looked at you, it wasn't just anger. It was fear, like you'd ruined a plan. David froze, the words hanging in the cool night air. Sullivan had seen it too. It was the same cold dread he had felt when Nathan had first laid eyes on him. A suit doesn't make the man, Sullivan continued, his eyes steady on David. I've known men who could build a car from scratch, but couldn't tie a necktie. And I've known men in $5,000 suits who couldn't change a tire, but would happily run you over with one. David nodded, understanding the subtext. Take a piece of advice, Sullivan said, his voice dropping lower. Guys like that don't forget. Be careful. And call me if you need anything. I still have friends in places that matter. The bus ride home was a blur. The city lights smeared across the rain-streaked windows of the aging diesel coach. But David saw none of it. He saw Nathan's face, a mask of fury and fear, like you'd ruined a plan. The words echoed in his mind. What plan could a janitor possibly ruin? He shook his head, trying to force the thoughts away. It wasn't his problem anymore. He had to think about Emma. He got off at his stop and walked the 2 blocks to his small apartment building in the shadow of the old Bedford Steel Works. Long closed now, but once the economic heart of the town. The light was on in their window, a warm yellow square in the darkness. That was his world, that small, safe square. Everything he did was to protect it. He let himself in. The familiar scent of home, a welcome comfort. He was just a janitor, a single father. He would take the suspension, cash the paychecks, and find another job mopping floors somewhere else if he had to. He would disappear again. He had to. He walked toward the living room, a practiced, quiet apology for being late already on his lips, his mind desperately trying to shove the events of the last hour into a locked box. But he knew with a chilling certainty that Nathan Blackwood had the key, and he would not stop until he'd used it. David walked into his small, tidy living room. His neighbor, Mrs. Coleman, a kind retiree with a halo of white hair, looked up from the kitchen table where she and Emma were working on a puzzle. "Daddy!" Emma squealed, jumping up from her chair and running to him, wrapping her arms around his legs. "We're making a dragon puzzle for you." David knelt and hugged her, burying his face in her hair, the scent of shampoo and crayons, a welcome anchor in the storm that was raging inside him. "It's the best dragon I've ever seen, sweetie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "David, you're home early," Mrs. Coleman said, her kind eyes crinkling with concern. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Maria," he lied, forcing a smile. "They had a plumbing issue in the main hall. Sent some of us home until it's fixed." The lie felt clumsy on his tongue. He spent the next hour trying to be normal. He sat at the table and helped with the puzzle. He listened as Emma chatted on about her day at school, but his mind was miles away in a sterile hospital room. He kept seeing Victoria Blackwood's face, the tremor in her hand, the blue tinge of her lips. It was a clinical puzzle his brain refused to let go of. Brugada syndrome, an atypical variant. It was the only thing that fit the rapid desaturation, the asymmetrical tremor, and the cardiac arrest without prior myocardial ischemia. A standard EKG might even miss it if the leads weren't placed to capture the specific electrical anomalies in the right ventricular outflow tract. The thought sent a chill down his spine. If they misdiagnosed her condition as a standard heart attack or stress-induced cardiomyopathy, the standard treatment protocol could kill her. Beta blockers, the go-to medication for most cardiac events, would be like pouring gasoline on a fire for someone with Brugada syndrome. After Emma was in bed, David sat in the darkness of his kitchen, the only light coming from the street lamp outside his window. His hands trembled slightly as he opened his laptop, the one he kept hidden in a locked drawer, separate from the family computer Emma used for homework. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the keyboard. He was about to cross a line, one that could unravel the careful anonymity he had built over the last 7 years. But a woman's life was at stake. And regardless of what name he used or what uniform he wore, he had taken an oath once. First, do no harm. But the corollary that few outside medicine understood, inaction can be the greatest harm of all. He opened a secure browser and typed a series of commands that would leave no trace. 7 years ago, when he had entered witness protection after testifying against Meridian Medical, a supplier that had knowingly sold defective equipment to combat hospitals, resulting in dozens of preventable deaths. He had been given a new identity: David Mercer, janitor. No longer Dr. David Halsey, trauma surgeon. But he had kept one connection to his old life, a digital lifeline to a man known only as Ghost, a former intelligence analyst who had been stationed at the same forward operating base in Afghanistan where David had served. Ghost owed him a life, and David was about to call in the debt. The encrypted message was simple: need info on patient Victoria Blackwood, admitted to Metro General tonight. Suspected Brugada syndrome, need to confirm diagnosis and treatment protocol. He closed the laptop and waited. Across town, Nathan Blackwood sat in a private waiting room at Metro General Hospital, a cup of untouched coffee on the table beside him. The head of cardiology, a respected doctor named Eleanor Reeves, entered the room, her face etched with professional concern. At 62, Dr. Reeves had the confident bearing of a woman who had fought her way through the male-dominated medical establishment of the 1980s and emerged victorious. "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Reeves began, "your sister is stable for now. The event in the lobby appears to be a severe case of stress-induced cardiomyopathy, likely brought on by extreme exhaustion. We've started her on a beta blocker to regulate her heart rhythm, and we should see steady improvement." Nathan nodded, his expression a perfect performance of a grateful, worried brother. "Thank you, doctor. That diagnosis aligns with what her specialist in Amsterdam has been treating her for. She has a history of these stress-induced episodes." He slid a business card across the table. "This is Dr. Marcus Jansen. He has her complete file. He's expecting a call from your office. He can provide any historical data you might need." "Excellent," Dr. Reeves said, taking the card. "This will be very helpful. It's always best to have a complete picture." "Just do whatever it takes to make her well, doctor," Nathan said, his voice laced with false sincerity. "Money is no object. The best care, the most aggressive treatment, whatever you recommend." He was handing the doctor a loaded gun and a signed permission slip to use it. The beta blockers, the standard treatment for a stress-induced event, would have a catastrophic effect on the delicate electrical channels of a heart with Brugada syndrome. Nathan knew it was only a matter of time. He had set the stage for a quiet, tragic, and perfectly believable death, one that would leave him as the sole heir to the Blackwood shipping empire, free to dismantle the environmental initiatives that were threatening the profit margins he'd promised to certain board members in exchange for their support. Later that evening, David tucked Emma into bed. She held up her dragon drawing for him to see one last time. "He'll keep the bad dreams away," she said seriously, her eyes drooping with sleep. "Yeah, he will," David whispered, kissing her forehead. He smoothed her comforter and watched her for a long moment, her small chest rising and falling in the soft glow of her nightlight. This was his peace. This was his sanctuary. Intervening in Victoria Blackwood's fate would put all of this at risk. Nathan Blackwood was not a man who would tolerate interference. He would dig, and if he found out who David really was, the quiet life he had built for his daughter would be annihilated. He walked back into the silent living room, the drawing of the dragon in his hand. He pinned it to the corkboard on the wall where they kept her artwork. He looked at the creature's fierce, protective eyes. "He'll keep the bad dreams away. But some bad dreams you couldn't run from. Some you had to turn and fight." He had been a doctor. He had taken an oath. He could not stand by and let a man murder his sister through medical malpractice, no matter the cost. His quiet life was a lie if he had to sacrifice his soul to keep it. "A peaceful life built on someone else's suffering isn't peace at all," his father had told him once. "It's just denial wrapped in a comfortable blanket." His decision made, a grim resolve settled over him. His laptop pinged. Ghost had come through. The message was brief but devastating. "Patient Blackwood, Victoria. Diagnosis: acute stress-induced cardiomyopathy, tachycardia. Treatment protocol: initiate IV metoprolol drip, 5 milligrams per hour. Sedation as needed. Monitor vitals." David's blood ran cold. Metoprolol, a beta blocker. It was a death sentence. For a normal stress-induced heart issue, it was standard practice. For Brugada syndrome, it was like pouring gasoline on a fire. It would suppress the heart's normal electrical regulators, leaving it vulnerable to the storm of chaotic, fatal arrhythmias the genetic disorder caused. They weren't just failing to treat her. They were actively loading the gun and pointing it at her heart. Below the image of the chart, a short typed note from Ghost. Brother provided extensive cardiac history from Amsterdam specialist. Looks legit. They think they have it under control. Prognosis listed as good. Prognosis good. David felt a wave of nausea. Her prognosis was fatal. They were killing her with confidence. Nathan had played them perfectly. He had the proof, but it was inadmissible. Obtained illegally. It was the word of a janitor against a renowned European specialist in a team of cardiologists at a top-tier hospital. He'd be laughed out of the room, then arrested for stalking or worse. Nathan would make sure of it. He had to find a way in. A human angle, someone on the inside who could be convinced. He thought back to the lobby. The bodyguards were loyal to the payroll. Davies, the manager, was a coward. Nathan was the enemy, but the assistant, the young man had looked genuinely terrified for Victoria, not just for his job. His panic had seemed personal. What was his name? He'd heard someone say it. Parker. Michael Parker. But how to get to him? He couldn't go to the hospital. He couldn't go back to the hotel. Nathan's people would be everywhere. David closed his eyes, forcing himself to replay the chaos in the lobby, searching for a detail. The paramedics had arrived. There was shouting. The assistant, Parker, had been on his phone, his voice frantic. What had he said? The memory surfaced. A single clear sentence in the noise. Cancel the morning briefing at the Waterford Conference Center. All Blackwood personnel are to await instructions. The Waterford Conference Center. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only shot he had. Nathan would be at the hospital playing the part of the devoted brother. His staff would be in limbo, gathered at the conference center. Parker would be there. David walked to Emma's door and pushed it open a crack. She was fast asleep, the dragon drawing on the wall standing guard. He looked at her peaceful face, and the risk he was about to take felt like a physical weight in his chest. He was about to step out of the shadows to make himself a target. But if he didn't, a woman would die. And the part of him that was once a doctor, the part of him that was still a good man, would die with her. Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same, he whispered, words his father had lived by. He scribbled a quick note for Mrs. Coleman for the morning. A simple lie about being called into work early. He grabbed his worn jacket, the one that let him blend into any city crowd, and slipped out of the apartment. The night was cool and damp. A storm was brewing in the distance, the first flashes of lightning illuminating the dark clouds rolling in from the west. David walked with purpose, his mind already planning his approach, his body remembering skills he had hoped never to use again. He was no longer invisible. He was a man with a mission, and for the first time in 7 years, he felt fully alive. The night air carried the metallic scent of an approaching storm. Lightning flashed in the distance as David made his way toward the Waterford Conference Center, its gleaming glass facade standing out against the darkening sky. Rain began to fall in heavy drops, drumming against his worn leather jacket as he surveyed the building from across the street. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows were parked outside, Blackwood corporate vehicles. David positioned himself in the shadows of a recessed doorway, watching as people occasionally entered and exited. The conference center's lobby was still illuminated, a corporate crisis clearly unfolding within. David's military training took over, assessing ingress points, security presence, and potential cover. He spotted 2 guards at the main entrance, private security, not standard conference center staff. Nathan was taking no chances. He needed to get inside without attracting attention. Circling the block, David found a service entrance at the rear of the building. A young man in kitchen whites stood just outside, sheltered from the rain, smoking a cigarette. David's plan formed instantly. Approaching casually, David pulled out a battered pack of cigarettes he kept for situations exactly like this. Not for smoking, but for making connections. Got a light? David asked, cigarette already between his lips. The kitchen worker nodded, offering his lighter. As David leaned in, he took the measure of the young man, early 20s, tired eyes, the look of someone working double shifts. Thanks, David said, taking a deep drag and exhaling slowly. Hell of a night to be stuck working. Tell me about it, the young man replied. Some corporate emergency meeting. They're all freaking out because the big boss had a heart attack or something. Blackwood Shipping, right? David asked, as if only vaguely interested. Yeah, they booked the place through tomorrow, But now everyone's running around like headless chickens. David nodded sympathetically. Been there. I'm with Metro General Maintenance, he lied smoothly. Got called in to check the backup generators for the storm. Someone said the conference center's on the same grid. The young man shrugged. Wouldn't surprise me. Power goes out here all the time. David glanced at his watch with practiced anxiety. They told me to use the service entrance, but nobody's answering the damn buzzer. My supervisor's gonna have my ass if I don't get this checked. The kitchen worker hesitated only briefly before holding the door open. Go through the kitchen, take a left at the end of the hall. Maintenance access is there. Just don't tell anyone I let you in. Appreciate it, David said, dropping his barely smoked cigarette and crushing it beneath his boot. Stay dry. Once inside, David moved with purpose. In his experience, people rarely questioned someone who looked like they belonged. The kitchen was busy with staff preparing for the morning, none of whom gave him a second glance as he walked confidently through their workspace. Following the young man's directions, David found himself in a service corridor lined with electrical panels and maintenance equipment. He located a supply closet, quickly ducking inside. There he found what he needed, a maintenance worker's vest hanging on a hook. He slipped it on over his clothes, completing his disguise. Now he needed to locate Michael Parker. The executive would likely be coordinating with the rest of the staff, managing the crisis Nathan had created. David grabbed a clipboard from the closet and headed toward the main conference area. The Waterford's Grand Ballroom had been converted into a command center. About 20 people in business attire huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Laptops were open, phones were ringing, and the tension in the room was palpable. David spotted Parker immediately. The young assistant stood at the center of the chaos, directing people with a strained but authoritative voice. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened and his usually neat hair disheveled from repeatedly running his fingers through it. David couldn't approach him directly. Too many people watching. He needed to isolate Parker. Noticing a thermostat control panel on the wall, David had his solution. Moving to the environmental control system, David carefully adjusted several settings. Within minutes, the air conditioning vents began emitting a low, rattling sound, followed by a blast of frigid air. Complaints immediately erupted around the room. Parker looked up in frustration, then spotted David in his maintenance vest, clipboard in hand, examining the thermostat. You, Parker called out, striding toward him. Can you fix that? We've got enough problems without freezing to death. David turned, keeping his face partially hidden by the clipboard. Working on it, sir. Looks like a compressor issue. Control panels in the utility room down the hall if you want to see the diagnostics. Parker hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave his post. Should only take a minute, David added. Need authorization to override the system. Parker sighed in frustration. Fine, let's make it quick. David led him down the corridor to a small utility room filled with electrical panels and building system controls. As soon as they were inside, David closed the door and turned to face Parker. Recognition dawned immediately on the assistant's face. You're the janitor from the hotel, he gasped, reaching for the door. David blocked his path. I need 5 minutes of your time. Ms. Blackwood's life depends on it. Get out of my way, Parker demanded, his voice rising. I'm calling security. Victoria spoke Dutch when she collapsed, David said quickly. She said they were trying to kill her. Did you understand what she was saying? Parker froze, his hand halfway to his phone. No, he admitted, I didn't. She's being given the wrong medication at the hospital right now, David continued, his voice intense but controlled. Metoprolol, it's a beta blocker, standard protocol for stress-induced cardiomyopathy, but that's not what she has. How could you possibly know what medication She has Brugada syndrome, David interrupted. It's a rare genetic cardiac condition that affects the heart's electrical system. Beta blockers will make it worse, potentially fatal. Parker's expression shifted from fear to confusion. How do you know all this? You're a janitor. I was a doctor, David said, the admission hanging in the air between them. A trauma surgeon. That's not important right now. What matters is that your boss is in danger. Rain pounded against the small window of the utility room, punctuating the tension. If what you're saying is true, Parker said slowly, why would they misdiagnose her? Metro General has some of the best cardiologists in the state. Because they were given false information, David replied. Medical records supposedly from a specialist in Amsterdam, provided by Nathan Blackwood. Parker's eyes widened. That's a serious accusation. Nathan would never. He would if he stands to gain from her death. David cut in. Who takes control of Blackwood Global if Victoria dies? The assistant's face paled as the implications sank in. This is insane. You're asking me to believe that Nathan is trying to murder his own sister? I'm asking you to make one phone call, David said, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket, to Dr. Eleanor Reeves, who's treating Victoria. Tell her you were on the phone with Victoria's specialist in Amsterdam, Jansen. Tell her the specialist mentioned that given Victoria's family history, they should run a procanamide challenge to definitively rule out a latent sodium channelopathy. A what? Sodium channelopathy, those exact words. David handed him the paper. It's the medical term for what she has. It's specific enough that Dr. Reeves will have to consider it. And if I refuse, David's expression hardened, then I hope you can live with yourself when Victoria Blackwood dies from a preventable arrhythmia in the next 24 hours. Parker stared at the paper, conflict evident on his face. I've worked for Victoria for 5 years, he said quietly. She paid for my mother's cancer treatment when insurance wouldn't cover it. She's tough as nails in business, but she's a good person. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the small room. Thunder followed almost immediately. Nathan's been pushing for control of the company for years, Parker continued, almost to himself. The environmental initiative Victoria's been championing, it's costing millions up front, but it would position Blackwood ahead of regulations coming down the pike. Nathan's been fighting it every step of the way. He looked up at David, decision made. I'm not saying I believe you about Nathan, but I won't take chances with Victoria's life. Parker pulled out his phone and dialed. After identifying himself to the hospital operator, he was quickly connected to Dr. Reeves. Dr. Reeves, this is Michael Parker, Victoria Blackwood's executive assistant. His voice was steady now, professional. I apologize for calling so late, but I was just speaking with Dr. Jansen in Amsterdam about Ms. Blackwood's condition. He paused, listening. Yes, that's right. He mentioned something specific he wanted me to pass along. Given her family history, he strongly recommended running a procanamide challenge to rule out a latent sodium channelopathy. Another pause. Parker's eyes widened slightly at whatever Dr. Reeves was saying. No, I don't have any medical training. I'm just relaying what Dr. Jansen told me. Yes, those were his exact words. I understand. Thank you, doctor. He hung up, looking at David with new respect and wariness. She knew exactly what I was talking about. Said she'd look into it immediately. He hesitated, then asked, how does a janitor know this kind of specialized medical information? That's a long story, David replied, and not one I have time to tell right now. Nathan will be back from the hospital soon, Parker warned. If he finds you here, I'll be gone before then. David removed the maintenance vest. Thank you for making that call. I didn't do it for you, Parker said. I did it for Victoria. That's good enough. As David turned to leave, Parker called after him. Hey, if you're right about this, about Nathan, be careful. He's not someone who forgives interference. David nodded grimly. I know. Across town at Metro General Hospital, Dr. Eleanor Reeves sat in her office, staring at Victoria Blackwood's medical chart with growing unease. The phone call from Parker had disturbed her more than she'd let on. Sodium channelopathy. The term was too specific, too technical to be something a layperson would invent. And it aligned with a nagging doubt she'd had since first reviewing the patient's EKG. She pulled up the electrical tracing again, focusing on leads V1 and V2. There, almost imperceptible, was a slight saddleback elevation of the ST segment, not the classic Brugada pattern, but a variant that could be easily missed or dismissed as a benign early repolarization. But combined with the sudden cardiac arrest and the specific request for a procanamide challenge, it was enough to warrant investigation. Dr. Reeves was writing orders to discontinue the metoprolol when her office door opened. Nathan Blackwood stood there, his expensive suit still immaculate despite the late hour. Dr. Reeves, he said smoothly, I thought I'd check on my sister's progress before heading back to the conference center. Mr. Blackwood, she replied, her professional mask firmly in place. Your sister is stable. The nurses report her vitals are improving. Excellent. I knew your treatment plan was the right approach. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I've been in touch with Dr. Jansen. He's very pleased with your management of Victoria's condition. Jez Reeves felt a chill at the base of her spine. Something wasn't right. That's interesting, she said carefully. I was just about to call Dr. Jansen myself. I have some questions about your sister's previous cardiac workup. No need to disturb him at this hour, Nathan said quickly. It's the middle of the night in Amsterdam. I can relay any questions you have when we speak tomorrow. I appreciate that, but I prefer to discuss medical details directly. She met his gaze steadily. It's standard protocol. Nathan's affable expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Of course, protocol is important. He glanced at her computer screen where Victoria's chart was displayed. I see you're still reviewing her case. Don't let me interrupt your work. I'll just look in on her before I leave. After he departed, Dr. Reeves sat motionless for a long moment. In 30 years of practice, she had developed a finely tuned intuition for when something was amiss. Right now, every instinct was screaming. She picked up her phone and dialed the cardiology fellow on call. Dr. Chen, I need you to prepare for a procainamide challenge on Victoria Blackwood in room 712. And I want the metoprolol drip discontinued immediately. But the chart says, I'm aware of what the chart says, Dr. Reeves interrupted. I'm changing the orders now. Have everything ready in 20 minutes. She hung up and stared at the business card Nathan had given her for Dr. Jansen. Making a decision, she dialed the international number. After 4 rings, a sleepy voice answered in Dutch. Dr. Reeves asked for Dr. Jansen in English. This is Jansen, the man replied, his accent thick. Dr. Jansen, this is Dr. Eleanor Reeves from Metro General Hospital in the United States. I'm calling about your patient, Victoria Blackwood. A pause. I have no patient by that name. Dr. Reeves felt her blood run cold. You're not treating Victoria Blackwood for stress-induced cardiomyopathy? No, came the confused reply. I've never heard of this person. I see. Dr. Reeves kept her voice steady. I apologize for disturbing you, Dr. Jansen. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. She hung up, then immediately called security. This is Dr. Reeves. I need additional personnel stationed outside room 7 immediately. No one enters without my explicit authorization. Sometimes Dr. Reeves thought grimly as she headed toward Victoria's room. The people closest to you are the ones who want you dead the most. Dr. Reeves arrived at Victoria's room to find Nathan already there, standing at his sister's bedside. The security guard she'd requested was just taking up position outside the door. Mr. Blackwood, she said, entering the room with deliberate calm, I need to perform some additional tests on your sister. I'd like to ask you to step out. Nathan turned, his expression carefully neutral. Is something wrong? Just a precautionary measure, Dr. Reeves replied. Some anomalies in her EKG I'd like to investigate further. Nathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What kind of anomalies? Possibly nothing, she said, but I'm concerned about the ST elevation in leads V1 and V2. It could indicate a form of sodium channelopathy rather than stress-induced cardiomyopathy. The flash of alarm in Nathan's eyes confirmed her suspicions. That sounds unnecessarily complicated, he said smoothly. Dr. Jansen has been treating her condition for years. I trust his judgment. Interesting, Dr. Reeves said, since I just spoke with Dr. Jansen, who claims he's never heard of Victoria Blackwood. The room went deathly silent. Nathan's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. You had no right to make that call. I had every right. I'm her physician of record. Dr. Reeves moved to Victoria's IV pole and shut off the metoprolol drip. And I'm discontinuing this medication immediately. You can't do that, Nathan said, his voice dropping dangerously. Actually, I can, and I am. Reeves pressed the call button. Nurse, please escort Mr. Blackwood to the waiting area. We're preparing Ms. Blackwood for a procedure. 2 nurses entered, along with the security guard. Nathan looked from them to Dr. Reeves, calculating his options. This is a mistake, he said finally, his voice cold. My sister's condition is well documented. Changing her treatment plan could endanger her life. I'll take full responsibility, Dr. Reeves replied. Now please wait outside. Nathan left, but the look he gave Dr. Reeves promised consequences. Once he was gone, Dr. Reeves turned to her team. Prep for the procainamide challenge immediately, and I want a full set of cardiac enzymes, electrolytes, and a 12-lead EKG with right-sided precordial leads. As the team prepared Victoria for the test, Dr. Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that she was caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than a medical disagreement. In the hospital's specialized procedure room, Victoria lay connected to monitors displaying her heart rhythm in steady green waves across the screen. The procainamide challenge was underway, with the medications slowly dripping into her IV. Dr. Reeves stood at the foot of the bed, watching the main screen intently. Nathan watched from the observation window, his arms crossed, a cruel smirk touching his lips. For a long minute, nothing happened. The green line continued its steady, rhythmic peak and fall. From the shadows near the far end of the corridor, David watched. He had slipped into the hospital wearing scrubs taken from the emergency department's locker room, his face partially obscured by a surgical mask. A common sight in hospitals even before the pandemic had made them ubiquitous. Inside the procedure room, Dr. Reeves's brow furrowed. The EKG was unchanged. Had she made a terrible mistake? "Increase the rate," she said, her voice tight. Another 30 seconds passed. Still nothing. From his vantage point at the observation window, Nathan's smirk widened. Then it happened. A flicker on the screen, a single malformed wave, then another. The steady rhythm of the ST segment began to curve upwards, transforming into the distinct, terrifying COVID shape that was the hallmark of Brugada syndrome. "There it is," Dr. Reeves breathed, a mixture of horror and vindication in her voice. "Brugada pattern type 1. I need a photo of that screen now." Before the nurse could move, the alarm on the monitor blared to life. The organized waves dissolved into a chaotic, useless, squiggling line. Ventricular fibrillation. Victoria's heart was no longer beating. It was merely quivering uselessly in her chest. "Code blue," Dr. Reeves yelled. "Get the crash cart. Charge to 200. The room exploded into disciplined action. Nurses rushed in. One began compressions. Dr. Reeves grabbed the defibrillator paddles. "Charging. Clear." Victoria's body convulsed on the bed. The chaotic line on the monitor remained. No conversion. "Charge again. 300. Clear." Another violent jolt. In the hallway, David watched the frantic scene through the glass, his own heart in his throat. He saw the grim determination on Dr. Reeves's face. He also saw Nathan. The smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of incandescent rage. His plan, years in the making, was crumbling into dust before his very eyes. "We have a rhythm," a nurse called out. A slow, steady beat returned to the screen. It was weak, but it was organized. They had brought her back. Reeves leaned against the mud, breathing heavily, sweat beading on her forehead. She had the proof. She had saved Victoria's life by nearly ending it, a calculated risk that had paid off. As the controlled chaos in the room began to subside, Nathan took a step back from the window, his mind racing, calculating his next move. His gaze swept the hallway, looking for a way to salvage the situation. And then he stopped. His eyes scanned past the nurse's station, past the waiting room, and into the shadows at the far end of the hall. He saw him. It was just for a second, a man in scrubs with a surgical mask, but he knew it was the janitor. He was here. He had seen it all. Their eyes locked across the long, sterile corridor. In that moment, everything fell away. The doctors, the nurses, the hospital. There were only two people in the world who understood exactly what had just happened. Nathan knew that David knew. The game had changed. This was no longer a quiet clinical execution. It was a hunt, and Nathan Blackwood was the predator. The moment their eyes locked, the world snapped into sharp, cold focus for David. The clinical drama in the procedure room vanished, replaced by a single primal instinct: run. He didn't wait for Nathan to raise a hand or shout an order. He saw the flicker of murderous recognition in the man's eyes, and that was enough. He turned and melted back into the shadows of the corridor, moving with a fluid silence that belied the frantic pounding of his heart. He heard a muffled command behind him, Nathan's voice speaking into his phone. "He's here, the janitor from the hotel. Find him. Black scrubs, surgical mask. He's in the West Wing. Do not let him leave this building." David didn't risk the main elevators or stairwells. He darted through a set of double doors marked staff only and found himself in a brightly lit but deserted utility hallway. He could hear the heavy footsteps of security guards echoing from the main corridor, their pace quickening. He was being hunted. He ran, his soft-soled shoes making little sound on the tiled floor. He knew the layout of places like this. Every hospital, every hotel, every large building had the same hidden anatomy. A skeleton of service tunnels, storage closets, and forgotten stairways. It was the world he lived in now. He yanked open a door to a janitor's closet, slipped inside, and closed it just as two of Nathan's men, broad-shouldered and grim-faced, rounded the far corner. He held his breath, the smell of ammonia and damp mops filling his lungs. He heard their footsteps pass, their voices low and urgent. He waited a beat, then slipped back out, heading in the opposite direction. He couldn't go up. He had to go down, to the basement, to the labyrinth of service corridors that was the true circulatory system of any large institution. He found a service elevator, pried the doors open with his fingers just enough to slip through, and found the emergency ladder running down the dark shaft. The descent was quick, his hands and feet finding purchase on the metal rungs with practiced ease. He landed in the basement, a place of humming generators and giant hissing pipes, the mechanical heart of the hospital. He was back in his element. He moved through the darkness with a sureness that Nathan's polished security team could never match. He found an emergency exit that led to a loading dock, pushed the bar, and was momentarily blinded by the glare of security lights illuminating the rain-slicked pavement. An ambulance was backing in, its lights flashing silently. David used it as cover, slipping past the distracted attendants and into the parking garage beyond. He was out, but he wasn't safe. His first thought, a bolt of pure, unadulterated terror, was of Emma. His apartment was compromised. It would be the first place Nathan would send his men. He couldn't go there. He couldn't call his own phone. Every second he wasted was a second they were getting closer to his daughter. David ran through the rain to a 24-hour convenience store 3 blocks from the hospital. Inside, he grabbed a disposable phone from a display near the register, paid cash, and hurried back into the storm. He dialed the one number he knew he could trust. Jack Sullivan picked up on the second ring. "Sullivan. Jack, it's David Mercer." His words came in a rush, voice tight with urgency. "I'm in trouble. The man I warned you about, Nathan Blackwood. He tried to have his sister killed at the hospital. I stopped it, and he saw me. He's hunting me, Jack. But that's not the problem. He knows where I live. Emma is there. My daughter is there." The line was silent for a moment, but David could hear the shift in Sullivan's breathing. The security professional was processing the threat. "Emma," Sullivan said, her name a statement of understanding. "She's with Mrs. Coleman, right?" "Yes, apartment 2B. You have to get them out of there now. Blackwood's men are coming for me, and they will not be gentle." "Where do I take them?" Sullivan's voice was all business now. "Anywhere. A hotel. Your place. Just get them away from their air. Don't let them pack. Just go." "I was a cop for 15 years before I took this job, kid," Sullivan said, a grim reassurance in his tone. "I remember how to handle myself. Be careful, Jack. These guys aren't hotel security." "Stay alive, David. I'll keep your girls safe." Sullivan hung up. David stood in the rain-soaked parking lot, water streaming down his face, feeling utterly helpless. He had just thrown his only friend into the line of fire, but he knew Sullivan was his best hope. The ex-cop had the skills and connections to protect Emma. Now David had to find a way to end this, to neutralize the threat Nathan posed, not just to him, but to Victoria and, most importantly, to Emma. As he considered his next move, his new phone rang. Unknown number. David answered cautiously. "Mr. Mercer." It was Michael Parker's voice, tense and hushed. "Victoria is stable. The test confirmed Brugada syndrome. Dr. Reeves is implementing the correct treatment protocol." "Nathan knows I was there," David said. "He's looking for me." "I know," Parker replied. "He's furious. He's called in private security. They're searching the hospital, and he's sent a team to your address." David's blood ran cold. "How does he know where I live?" "He has your employment file from the hotel," Parker explained. "Listen, I can't talk long. Nathan doesn't know I'm calling you, but you need to know he's not just trying to find you. He's ordered them to handle the situation permanently." The implication was clear. Nathan wanted him dead. Thanks for the warning, David said. I'm doing this for Victoria, Parker replied. She's asking about you, the janitor who spoke Dutch. Tell her I'm glad she's going to be okay. Where are you going now? Parker asked. Better you don't know, David said, and hung up. Across town, Sullivan drove his aging Ford Taurus through the storm-lashed streets of Bedford Falls, wipers struggling against the downpour. He had changed into dark clothes, a raincoat hiding the shoulder holster containing his licensed .38 revolver, a holdover from his police days that he kept meticulously maintained. The storm had intensified, sheets of rain reducing visibility to mere yards. Lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, followed by thunder that rattled windows. Perfect cover for what he needed to do. Sullivan parked a block from David's apartment building, scanning the street for unfamiliar vehicles or surveillance. The neighborhood was quiet, most windows dark at this late hour. But Sullivan's experienced eye caught the silhouette of a man sitting in a parked car halfway down the block. Too still, too alert for a resident. They were already here. Sullivan circled around, approaching the building from the rear alley. The service entrance was locked, but the old cop had never lost his skill with a set of picks. Within seconds, he was inside, moving silently up the back stairs. He reached David's floor and peered carefully around the corner. The hallway was empty. So far, Nathan's men were maintaining perimeter surveillance, not yet moving in. But that wouldn't last long. Sullivan reached apartment 2B and knocked softly. Mrs. Coleman, it's Jack Sullivan from the hotel. The door opened a crack, the security chain still engaged. Mrs. Coleman's concerned face appeared in the gap. Mr. Sullivan, what are you doing here at this hour? David sent me, Sullivan said, his voice low and urgent. There's an emergency. I need to get you and Emma somewhere safe, right now. Mrs. Coleman's eyes widened. Is David all right? He will be, but we need to move quickly. No time to pack. Just get Emma and come with me. The elderly woman hesitated only briefly before nodding. Give me 2 minutes. True to her word, Mrs. Coleman emerged moments later with a sleepy Emma, still in her pajamas but with a coat hastily pulled over them. Sullivan knelt down to the child's level. Hi, Emma. Remember me? I work with your dad at the hotel. Emma nodded, rubbing her eyes. The security man. Dad says you used to be a police officer. That's right, Sullivan smiled reassuringly. Your dad asked me to take you on a little adventure tonight, like a surprise sleepover. Does that sound okay? Emma looked uncertain. Where's my dad? He has to help someone, but he'll join us soon, Sullivan promised, hoping it wasn't a lie. Right now, we're going to play a game. It's called Silent Escape. We have to be very quiet and follow all my directions. Can you do that? Emma nodded solemnly, her young face serious beyond her years. Good girl, Sullivan said. Now we're going to go down the back stairs very quietly. If I squeeze your hand, that means freeze and don't make a sound. Understand? Another nod. Sullivan led them to the stairwell, his senses hyper-alert. As they descended, he heard the distinct sound of the front entrance opening, followed by multiple sets of footsteps. Nathan's men were making their move. Freeze, Sullivan whispered, holding Emma's small hand firmly in his. They stood motionless on the landing between floors, barely breathing. Apartment 2B, a male voice said from above. No witnesses. Make it clean. Sullivan's jaw tightened. These weren't security professionals. They were hitmen. The stakes had just risen dramatically. Silently, they continued down to the ground floor. Sullivan paused at the exit door, listening intently. Rain pounded outside, but he could make out the sound of a car engine idling nearby, likely a lookout positioned at the rear exit. Sullivan reached into his pocket and removed a small flashlight and a handful of coins. He gave the flashlight to Mrs. Coleman. When I open this door, he whispered, I want you to run straight across the alley to the fence. There's a gap behind the dumpster. Get through it and wait in the parking lot of the drugstore. I'll be right behind you. What are you going to do? Mrs. Coleman asked, clutching Emma's hand tightly. Create a diversion. Sullivan winked at Emma. Just part of the game, kiddo. Sullivan pushed the door open a crack. Through the rain, he could make out a black SUV parked 20 yards away, its headlights off but engine running. He tossed the handful of coins hard against a metal dumpster on the opposite side of the alley, creating a loud clattering noise. As expected, the SUV's headlights immediately flashed on, illuminating the area around the dumpster. The driver's door opened, and a man with a handgun emerged, moving cautiously toward the source of the noise. Now, Sullivan whispered, pushing Mrs. Coleman and Emma out the door in the opposite direction. They ran, hunched over, using the darkness and rain as cover. Sullivan waited until they reached the fence, then stepped out into the alley himself, deliberately splashing through a puddle. The man with the gun turned, spotting Sullivan's silhouette. "Hey, stop right there!" Sullivan ran, drawing the gunman away from Mrs. Coleman and Emma's escape route. A shot rang out, the bullet whining as it ricocheted off the brick wall near Sullivan's head. He ducked behind a parked car, drawing his own weapon. "Police!" Sullivan shouted with the full authority of his former profession. "Drop your weapon!" The ruse worked. The gunman hesitated, momentarily confused. Sullivan used the opportunity to fire a single shot that shattered the SUV's front tire. Then he was running again, zigzagging through the rain toward the gap in the fence where Mrs. Coleman and Emma had disappeared. More shots followed, but the combination of darkness, rain, and Sullivan's evasive movement kept him from being hit. He squeezed through the fence and found Mrs. Coleman and Emma crouching behind a dumpster in the drugstore parking lot. "Let's go," he said, leading them quickly to where he'd parked his car a block away. Once inside the vehicle, Sullivan didn't waste time. He pulled away from the curb, driving slowly at first to avoid attention, then accelerating once they were safely away from the neighborhood. "Are we still playing the game?" Emma asked from the back seat, her voice small. Sullivan met her eyes in the rearview mirror. The girl wasn't fooled. She knew something was wrong. "Not anymore, Emma," he said gently. "But you did great. Your dad would be proud." "Those men were bad, weren't they?" she asked. "They wanted to hurt my dad." Sullivan exchanged a glance with Mrs. Coleman, who looked pale and shaken. "Your dad helped someone who needed him," he explained carefully. "And sometimes that makes bad people angry. But don't worry, your dad knows how to take care of himself." "Where are we going?" Mrs. Coleman asked. "I have a cabin," Sullivan replied, his eyes constantly checking the mirrors for signs of pursuit. "About 2 hours north near Lake Charlevoix. It's off the grid. No address, no utilities in my name. Nobody knows about it except my brother." "What about David?" Mrs. Coleman's voice was strained with worry. "How will he find us?" Sullivan pulled out his phone at a stoplight, quickly typing a message to David using the burner number he had called from. "Emma safe. Heading to fishing spot. Remember the bass we caught last summer?" It was coded, but David would understand. Sullivan had mentioned the cabin to him once, describing a massive bass he'd caught there the previous summer. "He'll find us," Sullivan assured Mrs. Coleman. "David Mercer is a lot more capable than most people give him credit for." As they drove north through the storm, Sullivan's thoughts turned grim. The men at the apartment weren't just looking to intimidate or capture David. They had orders to kill. Nathan Blackwood had just escalated this from a corporate power play to something much darker. Back in Bedford Falls, David received Sullivan's message with profound relief. Emma was safe. Whatever happened now, his daughter was protected. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, then focused on his next move. He needed evidence, concrete, undeniable proof of Nathan's actions that couldn't be dismissed as the ravings of a janitor. He needed leverage. Standing in the shelter of a bus stop, rain cascading from the roof, David made another call, this time to Ghost. "I need more than information," David said when the digitally distorted voice answered. "I need access to Blackwood Global's financial records. And I need to know everything about Nathan Blackwood's connection to Arctic Petroleum." "That's not information," Ghost replied coldly. "That's corporate espionage. It comes with a higher price. Name it. When this is over, if you survive, you work for me. On call, medical expertise when needed, no questions asked." David hesitated only briefly. "Done." "Check your email in 1 hour," Ghost said, and disconnected. David's path was set. He had saved Victoria Blackwood's life twice now. But to truly protect her, and more importantly, to ensure Emma's safety, he needed to neutralize Nathan permanently. Not with violence, but with the kind of leverage that would make even a powerful man like Nathan Blackwood back down. The game had changed. The invisible man was stepping into the light, and he was bringing the truth with him. Ban Khaleesi Fun Ba của tôi hơi ngắn hơn so với yêu cầu. Chỉ khoảng 3.2 thay vì 6.2 theo outline. Tôi sẽ viết lại phần 3 chi tiết hơn, bám sát outline và đảm bảo đủ độ dài. The storm that had drenched Bedford Falls all night was moving north, following the same path as Sullivan's car. Dawn broke with tentative rays of sunlight piercing the cloud cover. illuminating the devastation left in the storm's wake. Downed power lines, flooded streets, and debris scattered across roads created an obstacle course that David navigated with grim determination. He had spent the night in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, paid for with cash. The room was bare bones, a sagging mattress, flickering fluorescent light, and the lingering smell of cigarettes. But it had what he needed: anonymity and working Wi-Fi. Ghost had delivered as promised. David's burner laptop now contained a trove of damning information. Financial records showing Nathan Blackwood had systematically diverted Blackwood Global funds through a series of shell companies. Communications between Nathan and executives at Arctic Petroleum discussing ways to sabotage Victoria's environmental initiative. Most damning of all, evidence that Nathan had been paying Dr. Marcus Jansen in Amsterdam for falsified medical records for over a year. David studied the documents carefully, his military-trained mind cataloging key details. Nathan had transferred over $8 million to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He had quietly acquired stock in Arctic Petroleum through a shell corporation called North Star Holdings. He had even planted negative stories in industry publications about the viability of the clean shipping technology Victoria championed. The pieces fit together into an ugly picture. Nathan had been planning Victoria's death for months, maybe years. The heart attack in the hotel lobby had been an unexpected complication. Victoria wasn't supposed to collapse in public with a janitor who spoke Dutch and had medical training nearby. David assembled the evidence methodically, organizing it for maximum impact. He created digital copies, stored them in encrypted cloud storage, and prepared physical backups on a USB drive he kept in a waterproof case in his pocket. If anything happened to him, the truth would still find its way to Victoria and the authorities. Now he needed to move. Sullivan's cabin was a 2-hour drive north, near Lake Charlevoix. With the storm damage slowing traffic, it might take longer. Every minute mattered. Nathan's men had nearly caught Sullivan, Emma, and Mrs. Coleman at the apartment. They wouldn't stop hunting. David had acquired a different vehicle, a battered 1997 Ford F-150 pickup he'd bought for $2,100 cash from a mechanic whose shop had been flooded in the storm. The owner had been grateful for the quick sale of a vehicle he'd written off as a loss. David had been grateful for transportation that couldn't be traced to him. The truck's engine had a whirring knock, but David had spent enough time around military mechanics to recognize it as a loose rod bearing, annoying but not immediately catastrophic. The transmission ground unhappily when shifting into third gear, and the brakes squealed like wounded animals. But the four-wheel drive worked. The truck would get him to the cabin. As he drove north on back roads to avoid main highways, David's mind kept returning to Victoria Blackwood. She was safe for now. Dr. Reeves would ensure she received the proper treatment for Brugada syndrome, likely an implantable cardioverter defibrillator to prevent future arrhythmias. But Nathan still posed a threat. If he tried once to kill his sister, he would try again. David ran through possible scenarios in his head, the way he'd once planned emergency surgeries in combat situations. What were the variables? What could go wrong? What resources did he have? The mental exercise kept him focused, preventing the fear and exhaustion from overwhelming him. He stopped briefly at a rural gas station to refuel and check his phone. A message from Michael Parker awaited him. VB stable, scheduled for ICD implantation tomorrow. NB furious, increased security presence. Be careful. David felt a moment of relief. Victoria was receiving the right treatment. The implantable cardiac defibrillator would protect her from future arrhythmias caused by her Brugada syndrome. At least medically, she was out of immediate danger. 2 hours into the drive, David's phone buzzed with a message from Sullivan. Company at the cabin. Secure. Proceed with caution. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Sullivan's coded message meant Nathan's men had found the cabin. But secure indicated that Sullivan had the situation under control, at least for now. Still, proceed with caution was a clear warning. The final 30 minutes of the drive took David through increasingly remote terrain. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to rutted dirt tracks winding through dense pine forest. The F-150's four-wheel drive proved its worth as he navigated muddy patches and washouts from the storm. Twice, David had to stop to clear fallen branches from the road. The physical labor was almost welcome, a simple, concrete task amidst the complicated danger he faced. Each log or branch he dragged aside was one more obstacle overcome, one step closer to Emma. Finally, he reached the designated turnoff, unmarked except for a rusted mailbox with no name or number. David killed the engine a quarter mile from the cabin and continued on foot, moving silently through the underbrush with the practiced stealth of a combat medic who had navigated hostile territory. The forest was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the storm. Water dripped from leaves and branches, and the ground squelched beneath David's boots. He moved carefully, using the wet conditions to muffle his footsteps while scanning constantly for signs of danger. The cabin came into view, a modest structure of weathered logs beside a small, secluded lake. It looked peaceful, but David spotted the signs of intrusion immediately. Tire tracks in the mud that didn't match Sullivan's Taurus. A subtle disturbance in the natural arrangement of branches near what would be the cabin's blind spot. Most telling of all, the curtain in the front window twitched in a pattern David recognized. 3 short movements. Sullivan's signal that hostiles were present but contained. David circled the property, staying within the tree line. He found a black Cadillac Escalade hidden behind a stand of pines, its expensive leather interior incongruous in the rustic setting. In the cabin's detached woodshed, he counted 2 men unconscious and bound with heavy-duty zip ties. Sullivan had been busy, but where was Nathan? The Escalade suggested he was nearby. David checked his watch. 20 minutes since he'd arrived, and no sign of additional security forces. Nathan must have come with minimal backup, confident in his ability to overpower Sullivan and capture Emma. Another miscalculation from a man who underestimated those he considered beneath him. A twig snapped behind David. He dropped instinctively, rolling to the side as a blow whistled through the air where his head had been a moment before. Nathan Blackwood stood over him, a heavy branch in his hands, face contorted with rage. His expensive suit was torn and muddied, his perfectly styled hair disheveled, but the cold fury in his eyes was unchanged. "You," Nathan spat, the janitor who wouldn't mind his own business. David scrambled to his feet, maintaining distance. He noted Nathan's stance, the way he favored his right side, the controlled rhythm of his breathing. This wasn't a desperate businessman lashing out. This was someone with training. "It's over, Nathan," David said evenly. "I know everything. About the falsified medical records, the embezzlement, the deal with Arctic Petroleum." "You know nothing," Nathan sneered, advancing slowly. "You're a janitor, a nobody. Who's going to believe you over me?" "The evidence speaks for itself," David replied calmly. "And it's already in the hands of people who matter." Nathan lunged suddenly, swinging the branch with surprising speed. David sidestepped, but the edge of the makeshift weapon caught his shoulder, sending a jolt of pain down his arm. "Corporate security training," David observed, recognizing the controlled aggression. "Blackwater? Or one of their competitors?" Nathan's eyes narrowed. 2 years with Aegis, not that it matters to you." David nodded. Private military contractors often provided personal combat training to high-level executives. It explained Nathan's confidence in coming here with minimal backup. "Where's your daughter, janitor?" Nathan taunted, circling like a predator. "My men found your apartment empty. Pity, she might have convinced you to be reasonable." Cold fury washed over David. "Your men aren't coming to help you," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "They're tied up at the moment." Nathan's confident smirk faltered slightly. "Sullivan," he muttered. "The hotel's security guard. I underestimated him." "People in uniform," David said. "We tend to look out for each other." "Enough talk." Nathan charged again. This time David was ready. He ducked under the swing and drove his shoulder into Nathan's midsection, using the man's momentum against him. They both went down, rolling through mud and pine needles in a desperate grapple. Nathan was stronger than he looked. The pampered executive exterior concealed a man who clearly spent hours in private gyms. But David had survival training and experience that couldn't be bought with a platinum membership. As they fought, David realized Nathan was trying to work his hand inside his jacket. A gun. Nathan had a concealed weapon. David twisted violently, trapping Nathan's arm. Using leverage gained from countless hours of practicing field medicine in impossible positions, he hyperextended Nathan's elbow until something gave with a sickening pop. Nathan howled in pain, his injured arm now useless. David rolled away, getting back to his feet, breathing hard. It's over, David repeated. You've lost. I haven't begun to fight, Nathan snarled, reaching awkwardly with his good hand into his jacket. The cabin door burst open. Jack Sullivan stood there, his service revolver aimed steadily at Nathan. At 58, Sullivan still carried himself with the unmistakable authority of his former profession. I wouldn't, he advised coldly. Nathan froze, then slowly raised his hand in surrender, his face a mask of hatred. Emma? David asked urgently. Safe inside with Mrs. Coleman, Sullivan replied, not taking his eyes off Nathan. She's been asking for you. Relief washed over David, nearly buckling his knees. Emma was safe. That was all that mattered. Sullivan gestured with his gun. Inside. Now. They marched Nathan into the cabin, a rustic single room with a stone fireplace and simple furniture. The interior smelled of wood smoke and pine, with fishing gear hanging from hooks on the walls and a stack of worn paperback westerns beside an old armchair. It was a place built for solitude and simplicity, far removed from the corporate battlefields where Nathan operated. Emma sat at a small wooden table with Mrs. Coleman, a half-finished game of checkers between them. When she saw David, her face lit up. Daddy! She ran to him, and he scooped her up with his good arm, holding her tight against his chest. Hey, Dragon Girl, he whispered, using his private nickname for her. You okay? She nodded against his shoulder. Mr. Sullivan said you were helping someone important, like when you fixed Mrs. Peterson's sink when it flooded, even though it was midnight. David smiled despite everything. The simple logic of children, equating emergency plumbing with life-or-death medical intervention. Something like that, he agreed. Sullivan had secured Nathan to a sturdy wooden chair, using zip ties from his emergency kit. The executive glared at them all, his dislocated arm hanging awkwardly. That needs to be reduced, David observed clinically. You offering to help the man who tried to kill you? Sullivan asked incredulously. I'm a doctor, David said simply. Or I was. Understanding dawned on Sullivan's weathered face. That explains a few things, like how you knew exactly what was wrong with Victoria Blackwood when everyone else was clueless. David set Emma down. Sweetie, why don't you and Mrs. Coleman go check out the lake? I bet there are some interesting rocks to collect. Emma looked uncertain but nodded when Mrs. Coleman took her hand. 20 minutes, no more, the older woman said, understanding the need to get the child out of earshot. Once they were gone, David approached Nathan. This will hurt, he said, grasping the man's arm. With a quick, practiced motion, he manipulated the joint back into place. Nathan grunted in pain but said nothing, his eyes burning with hatred. Your men will wake up with headaches but no permanent damage, Sullivan informed him. Unlike what they had planned for us. What now? Nathan finally spoke. You can't keep me here forever. No, David agreed. Just long enough for Victoria to receive some very interesting documents I've compiled. Financial records, communications with Arctic Petroleum, payments to Dr. Jansen. Nathan's face paled slightly. You're bluffing. David pulled out his phone and showed Nathan the screen, a confirmation receipt for a secure file transfer to Michael Parker. Victoria's assistant has everything now. I imagine the board of Blackwood Global will find it fascinating reading. You've signed your death warrant, Nathan hissed. I have resources you can't imagine, connections. You'll never be safe. That's where you're wrong, a new voice said from the doorway. Victoria Blackwood stood there, pale but steady, supported by Michael Parker and a tall, imposing man with the watchful stillness of a professional soldier. Eric Visser, Victoria's head of security from Amsterdam, had the scarred hands and vigilant eyes of someone who had seen serious action. Victoria? Nathan's voice cracked. How? I checked myself out against medical advice, she said, moving carefully into the cabin. A bulky dressing visible beneath her cashmere sweater suggested the doctors had already implanted the cardiac defibrillator. Dr. Reeves wasn't happy, but after reading what Michael showed me, I didn't have time to convalesce. She looked at David, her eyes sharp with recognition. You're the janitor who spoke Dutch, the one who saved my life. David nodded. David Mercer. Dr. David Halsey, actually, she corrected him, formerly of the 10th Combat Support Hospital. Distinguished service in Afghanistan before testifying against Meridian Medical and entering witness protection. David tensed. How did you— I have resources too, Victoria said with a thin smile. Not all of them are corporate. She nodded toward Visser, who stood silent and watchful by the door. Eric has connections with military intelligence. Once we had your real name, the rest wasn't difficult to piece together. She turned to her brother, her expression hardening. You tried to kill me, Nathan? My own brother. Victoria, you don't understand, Nathan began, desperation creeping into his voice. The environmental initiative was going to ruin us. The board was turning against you. I was trying to save the company. By committing murder? Victoria's voice was ice. By falsifying medical records to ensure I'd receive treatment that would trigger a fatal arrhythmia. Business is war, Nathan said flatly. You've always been too soft to understand that. Father would have done the same. Victoria's face tightened with anger. Don't you dare invoke our father. He built this company by creating value, not by destroying it. He understood that profit without purpose is meaningless. Pretty words, Nathan sneered. But they don't change the fact that your environmental crusade is bleeding us dry. Arctic Petroleum offered me a seat on their board. With the capital I could have raised, I could have rebuilt Blackwood into something Father would truly be proud of. Something he would be proud of? Victoria repeated incredulously. By gutting the environmental initiatives? By returning to the very practices that are destroying our oceans? By murdering your own sister? She studied him for a long moment. No, Nathan, I understood perfectly. I just chose not to sacrifice my humanity for profit margins. She turned to Visser. Take him. The security chief moved with fluid efficiency, releasing Nathan from the chair only to secure him with his own restraints. Where are you taking him? David asked. To face justice, Victoria replied. The evidence you gathered is more than enough for criminal charges. Attempted murder, corporate espionage, embezzlement, conspiracy. Nathan struggled futilely against Visser's grip. You can't do this. I'm a Blackwood. So am I, Victoria said quietly, and I will not let our family name become synonymous with corruption and murder. She nodded to Visser, who led the still protesting Nathan outside. The cabin fell silent. Sullivan excused himself to check on Nathan's men, leaving David alone with Victoria and Parker. You risked everything, Victoria said, studying David with intense curiosity. Your anonymity, your daughter's safety, your life, what? I took an oath once, David replied simply. First, do no harm. But inaction can be the greatest harm of all, Victoria finished, surprising him. My father was a doctor before he built Blackwood Shipping. He used to say that. David's eyebrows rose. Your father was a physician? Victoria nodded. A ship's doctor initially. That's how he learned the maritime industry from the inside out. Her expression softened. He would have liked you, Halsey. It's Mercer now, David corrected gently. Halsey died 7 years ago. Did he? Victoria asked, her gaze penetrating. It seems to me he was very much alive in that hotel lobby. Before David could respond, the cabin door opened again. Emma and Mrs. Coleman returned, the little girl clutching a collection of colorful lake stones. Daddy, look what I found! Emma ran to him, proudly displaying her treasures. David knelt down, examining each stone with exaggerated interest as Emma explained their special properties. Victoria watched the interaction, a thoughtful expression on her face. This one's for protection, Emma explained seriously, holding up a smooth black stone with a vein of white quartz running through it. And this blue one is for healing. She hesitated, then selected a small reddish stone. And this one is for you, she said, offering it to Victoria. Victoria looked surprised. For me, that's very kind, but why? Because you're hurt, Emma said simply. Daddy always says red stones are for strength, and you need to be strong to get better. Victoria accepted the stone, visibly moved by the child's gesture. Thank you, Emma. I'll keep it with me. Later, as Emma napped on the cabin's small couch, exhausted from the night's adventures, Victoria approached David again. What will you do now? She asked quietly. Your cover is blown. Witness protection will want to relocate you. David looked at his sleeping daughter. I don't know. Start over somewhere new, I guess. Again. The weariness in his voice was bone deep. This will be Emma's third school in 7 years. Or, Victoria said carefully, you could come work for me. David's head snapped up. What? Blackwood Global has a medical division, she explained. Small but growing. We provide healthcare services to remote maritime communities and disaster areas, places traditional healthcare doesn't reach. I'm not a doctor anymore, David said. My license can be reinstated, Victoria interrupted. The circumstances of your testimony against Meridian Medical were extraordinary. With the right legal team, which I happen to have, we could make a compelling case to the medical board. David stared at her, stunned. Why would you do that for me? You saved my life twice, Victoria replied simply. But more than that, you were willing to sacrifice everything for what was right. She smiled slightly. The world needs more people who know how to use wrenches, de Mercer, both the literal and metaphorical kind. The corner of David's mouth twitched in surprised recognition of his own words. You heard that? I notice things too, Victoria said, especially when people think I'm not listening. Sullivan returned, informing them that Nathan and his men had been taken into custody by Eric Visser and his team. Local sheriff's department is sending deputies, he added. They'll want statements from all of us. David nodded, glancing at Emma. I'll have to explain this to her somehow. Kids are resilient, Sullivan said, more than we give them credit for. She shouldn't have to be resilient, David replied softly. She should just be a kid. Victoria watched this exchange with thoughtful eyes. Mr. Sullivan, she said suddenly, would you be interested in a change of career? Sullivan raised an eyebrow. Depends on the career, ma'am. I'm planning to establish a community clinic in Bedford Falls, Victoria explained. Part of Blackwood's corporate responsibility initiative. We'll need someone to handle security and administration, someone who knows the community and has experience with both law enforcement and private security. Sullivan looked surprised and suspicious. Why Bedford Falls? It's a town that's suffered from industrial decline, Victoria replied smoothly. Perfect candidate for our community investment program. And it happens to be where Dr. Mercer and his daughter have made their home. Understanding dawned on Sullivan's weathered face. You're offering to keep them here, no more running. Victoria nodded. With proper security and legal protection, there's no reason they should have to leave. The threat from Meridian Medical has diminished over the years, and with Nathan's network dismantled, that danger is neutralized as well. And the witness protection program? David asked skeptically. They won't just let me walk away. Leave that to my legal team, Victoria said with confidence. The program exists to protect witnesses, not imprison them. If we can demonstrate that your safety is assured through other means, arrangements can be made. David looked at his sleeping daughter again, torn between hope and disbelief. It's not that simple. Nothing worthwhile ever is, Victoria agreed, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. 3 months later, David stood outside a modest building in downtown Bedford Falls. What had once been an abandoned hardware store was now a gleaming medical clinic. Workers were installing the sign above the entrance, Riverside Community Clinic, in large letters, with a Blackwood Global Healthcare Initiative in smaller text beneath. The interior had been completely transformed, modern examination rooms, a small laboratory, a pharmacy, and a comfortable waiting area filled with practical furniture built to withstand heavy use. Nothing flashy or ostentatious, but everything of quality. David wore a white coat again, the familiar weight both strange and comforting after so long. His name badge read David Mercer, M.D. His past hadn't been erased, but integrated. His witness protection identity legally consolidated with his medical credentials through Victoria's influence and legal team. Sullivan approached, clipboard in hand. He had traded his hotel security uniform for business casual attire, befitting his new role as clinic administrator. The last of the equipment arrived this morning, he reported. We'll be ready for the open house tomorrow. David nodded, running his hand along the reception counter. I still can't believe this is happening. Believe it, Sullivan said, clapping him on the shoulder. Though I'm still getting used to calling you doctor instead of janitor. David smiled. I'm still getting used to hearing it. The front door opened, and Emma burst in, school backpack bouncing. Dad, Miss Victoria is here, she announced excitedly. Victoria Blackwood followed more sedately, her tailored business suit a stark contrast to Emma's colorful school clothes. But the genuine smile she gave the child as she held the door matched Emma's enthusiasm. The sign looks good, Victoria observed, joining David and Sullivan. though I still think Mercer Community Clinic would have been more appropriate. David shook his head. We've been through this. I'm not comfortable having my name on the building. The invisible man stays invisible? Victoria asked with a raised eyebrow. Old habits, David admitted, but I'm working on it. Emma tugged at Victoria's sleeve. Can I show you my office now? Dad says I can have the corner desk for doing homework after school. I would be honored to see your office, Miss Mercer, Victoria replied formally, allowing herself to be led away by the excited child. Sullivan watched them go, then turned to David with a knowing look. So you and Ms. Blackwood. It's complicated, David said quickly. Sullivan snorted. Life's complicated. Doesn't mean you run from the good parts. Before David could respond, his phone buzzed with a message. Ghost. The encrypted text was brief. Contract fulfilled. Debt paid. Good luck, doctor. David stared at the screen. When he'd agreed to work for Ghost in exchange for the information on Nathan, he'd expected years of clandestine medical consultations. Instead, Victoria had used her connections to negotiate his release from that obligation. Another debt he could never fully repay. The door opened again as Eric Visser entered. The security chief had become a regular presence in Bedford Falls, overseeing the protection detail Victoria had insisted on maintaining. His team was discreet but thorough, ensuring that neither Meridian Medical nor any of Nathan's former associates could threaten David or Emma. Perimeter secure, Visser reported in his clipped Dutch accent. The board members will arrive at 0900 tomorrow for the inspection before the opening ceremony. Victoria returned with Emma, who was chattering excitedly about decorating plans for her office. Everything ready for tomorrow? Victoria asked. David nodded, as ready as we'll ever be. Good, Victoria said, because I've invited some special guests. The mayor, obviously, the local press, and Dr. Eleanor Reeves. David looked surprised. Dr. Reeves is coming? All the way from Metro General? She's considering our offer to join as a consulting cardiologist, Victoria explained, 1 day a week. This community needs specialty care too, not just primary services. Emma tugged at David's coat. Can I show Ms. Victoria my rocks now? I organize them by color and healing properties. David smiled, if Ms. Victoria has time. I always have time for geological classification systems, Victoria said solemnly, winking at David over Emma's head. As they walked together through the clinic David had once only dreamed of creating, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed in just a few months. From invisible janitor to respected physician, from running to standing his ground, from isolation to whatever was developing between him and Victoria. Nathan Blackwood was awaiting trial, his financial empire dismantled. The evidence David had gathered had been overwhelming, leaving Nathan's high-priced lawyers little room to maneuver. Victoria had reclaimed full control of Blackwood Global, accelerating the environmental initiatives that had so threatened her brother and his fossil fuel allies. The next morning, as David prepared to address the gathered crowd at the clinic's opening ceremony, he felt a moment of panic. Public speaking had never been his forte, and years of cultivating invisibility had only heightened his discomfort with being the center of attention. Victoria, sensing his anxiety, squeezed his hand briefly. Just speak from the heart, doctor, the way you do with your patients. David nodded, taking a deep breath. Emma sat in the front row between Sullivan and Mrs. Coleman, giving him an enthusiastic thumbs up. Ladies and gentlemen, David began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. Today we open more than just a clinic. We open a promise to this community. As he continued, describing the services the clinic would provide and the philosophy behind it, David felt the last vestiges of Dr. Halsey, the man who had been forced into hiding, finally merge with David Mercer, the man he had become. He wasn't invisible anymore, and that was okay. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and toured the facility, Victoria joined David in his new office. On his desk stood a framed photograph of Emma, and beside it a small glass jar containing the colored stones she had collected at Sullivan's cabin. You know, Victoria said, picking up the red stone Emma had given her months ago, which she still carried in her pocket, I never properly thanked you. For saving your life? David asked. I think the clinic more than covers that. Victoria shook her head. Not for saving my life, for risking yours. She placed the stone back among the others. Most people look away from injustice when confronting it might cost them something. You didn't. Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same, David quoted. Your father's words? Victoria guessed. David nodded. He was a mechanic, fixed farm equipment mostly, but he understood more about ethical choices than most philosophy professors. I wish I could have met him, Victoria said softly. He would have liked you, David replied. He always said you could judge people by how they treat those who can do nothing for them. Victoria smiled. And how do I measure up on the Mercer scale of human decency? Pretty well, David admitted, for a CEO. Victoria laughed, a sound that transformed her usually composed features. High praise indeed. Emma burst into the office, followed by Sullivan, who shrugged apologetically. She insisted on showing Dr. Reeves her rock collection. Apparently, the good doctor is also a geology enthusiast. The healing properties of stones is a fascinating intersection of cultural belief systems and mineralogy, Dr. Reeves has said, entering behind them. The distinguished cardiologist looked slightly bemused as Emma eagerly sorted through her collection. This one's for heart healing, Emma was explaining, holding up a pink stone. It would be perfect for your patients. Dr. Reeves accepted the stone with appropriate seriousness. I'll keep it in my office at the hospital, she promised. As the impromptu geology lesson continued, Victoria moved to stand beside David, their shoulders barely touching. A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be standing in a community clinic in Bedford Falls, watching my cardiologist discuss healing stones with the daughter of a former janitor who saved my life, I'd have questioned their sanity, she murmured. Life takes unexpected turns, David agreed. Indeed it does, Victoria said. The question is, are you ready for where this particular turn might lead? David looked at her, understanding the deeper question. I spent 7 years being invisible, he said quietly. I think I'm ready to be seen, especially by you. Victoria's smile was warm, private, a moment of connection in the midst of the busy clinic. Good, she said simply, because sometimes the real heroes aren't the ones making the speeches or wearing the suits. They're the ones with the courage to step into the light when it matters most. David watched as Emma enthusiastically explained her stone classification system to the assembled medical professionals. His daughter was thriving, no longer the child of a man in hiding, but of a doctor respected in his community. The weight of constant vigilance had lifted from his shoulders. The invisible man had become visible again, not through grand gestures or public acclaim, but through the simple, profound act of doing what was right, regardless of the cost. And in that visibility, he had found not exposure or vulnerability, but strength and connection. And as he moved to join the others, David realized that the true measure of a life wasn't found in titles or uniforms or public recognition. It was found in the courage to use whatever tools you had, whether a scalpel, a mop, or simply your own 2 hands, to make the world a little better than you found it.